Good morning, everyone. Today is Thursday, January 26th, 2023, and welcome to this episode of the New Possibilities Hour, part of the Will Work for Food project, founded by Natalie Armstrong-Motin in the spring of 2020. Every Thursday morning, Jean Lawler and I are delighted to host another episode of our webinar designed for mediators, arbitrators, lawyers, and anybody who negotiates. As you know, there's no charge for these great webinars. Rather, we ask you to contribute to a food bank, either one designated by our speaker or one of your own choice, if you're in a position to do so. And one of my favorite parts of the webinar every week is when we announce the running total of just how much our generous audiences have contributed to food banks around the world in honor of our great speakers since this series began. Jean Lawler, would you please do the honors?
Well, thank you, Jeff. Absolutely, with pleasure. It was a big week with last week with Peter Robinson. So thanks to him and to every other speaker. Our total now, of which we know, of which we've been advised, is that donations in the amount of $357,425.40 have been made to food banks around the world, thanks to the generosity of this community. So that's fantastic. Thank you all.
Fabulous, fabulous news. Thank you all so much for your generosity, and thanks to our great speakers for their wonderful presentations. Today's presentation, I am confident, will be one of the finest, one of the most interesting, and one of the most compelling. Kent Halkett will give a more elaborate introduction of himself. Let me just say that he and I have known each other for probably 35 years, at which time we met when we were both practicing law here in Los Angeles as partners in significant law firms. And we were opposing counsel in a case. And we're still talking and we're still friendly. So how about that? Kent is going to be speaking to us on the very important subject of mental health in the legal profession. Kent is uniquely qualified to address this topic with us, having written extensively about it, based in a significant part on his own experience with these issues, having the courage to talk about surviving his own suicide attempt back in the year 2015. Kent, we're delighted that you are with us. You've since moved from Los Angeles to Tennessee, taken up different sort of work. We're very excited to hear all about it. Please tell us a little bit about the food bank to which you would like people to contribute if they're able, and then on with your presentation. My friend, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you for all of our attendees. Before I get started, I'd really like to thank our host, the Will Work for Food organization, for inviting me to talk with everyone today on the mental health challenges in the worlds of law and alternative dispute resolution. Included in that thank you goes to our moderators today, Jeff and Jean, our program coordinator, Sarah, and the rest of their team. And I'd like to thank everybody who's taken the time out of their busy day to join us. Thank you for your time and attention. And please feel free to reach out and ask questions. There's a Q&A session at the end. And also in a minute, we'll go to a image with my personal cell phone and email. If you'd like more privacy or more time and would like to reach out to me via email or telephone, I'm happy to talk to people. And it's been my experience when I give similar talks, it's never failed that at least one attendee has reached out. As Jeff mentioned, I have a designated charity or food organization that I've designated for those of you who are so inclined to make a donation. And my organization is the Second Harvest Food Bank of Middle Tennessee. Briefly, it opened in 1978 as a result of community leaders hoping to find or to provide a central distribution center for individuals, groups, and companies to help provide food for the hungry people in Middle Tennessee. That work has expanded to include working to advance hunger solutions. They can do a better job than I can with their website listing the multitude of good works they do, but a couple of things that I think will catch your attention as it caught mine. 96 cents out of every dollar donated goes directly to the fooding programs that they work with, which for those of you who work with nonprofits and charities, that's a staggering number. Second, they collect close to 400 pounds of food a week that is distributed, and during the course of a year provide over 35 million meals. So I think very highly of them, and I hope you do too. Turning to our program today, Jeff asked me to say a little about myself, and I'm going to say as little as possible, but I'm a professional attorney and an amateur author. And starting about 2 years ago, a lot of my focus shifted to mental health in the law, and it kickstarted with the publication that's on your screen now, an article called Mental Health in the Legal Profession, a Crisis, a Case Study, and a Call to Action. It was the cover article in the January-February 2021 issue of the Tennessee Bar Journal. By way of formal experience, I'm not a medical doctor. I'm not traditionally trained expert on alcohol problems or drug and substance abuse problems. And quite frankly, I'm not even formally trained as a mental health or mood disorder professional. But what I am is an old attorney with a mood disorder with a lot of practical experience. As Jeff mentioned, I have been and I am a trial attorney in the United States for over 40 years. I've practiced at the trial and appellate level in state, federal, and bankruptcy courts. I've appeared in countless mediations and arbitrations. And for a brief period, a long time ago, when my hair was dark, I was a court-appointed mediator for the trial court in LA Superior Court in Los Angeles, California. I'm licensed to practice law in California and Tennessee, and I was in big law for over 13 years in the 80s and 90s, including 10 years as a partner in a 1,600-person law firm, which at that time was the 5th largest law firm in the world. I was diagnosed with depression in 1995 and major depression in 2015, and I still have depression. I survived a very serious suicide attempt in July of 2015, followed by 7 weeks in the premier mental health facility in the United States, the Mediator Clinic in Houston, Texas. I take medication daily, and I have a psychiatrist. My goal for today's presentation is, there are several. One is to put a face to my article and to put some meat on the bare bones of that article. Next is to expand the essence of that article and my mental health journey to mediators, arbitrators, and judges, as well as to expand the reach of my mental health journey and message to a more worldwide audience. And from my perspective, mine is a story and a message of hope. And hopefully, with any luck, those of you listening today will share that assessment at the end of my remarks. I'd like to start out with making some working assumptions, since we are honored to have a broad range of attendees by way of attorneys, mediators, arbitrators, and judges, and a worldwide representation, but we're limited to an hour. So I apologize at the front end that I'm not going to be able to spend enough time to explore these topics and resources in the depth that they warrant. But hopefully this will give you a head start for those of you who want to learn more about this area. Therefore, as a practical matter, some assumptions I've made, which are hopefully well-founded, is that most, if not all, of the attendees today have had some form of legal training or background. I'm fairly confident for those of you who are attorneys and judges that's true. And I presume, based on my experience, that most mediators and arbitrators have some legal training, if not having been attorneys or judges themselves. The other assumption I want to make is that the mental health challenges faced by mediators and arbitrators are similar to those faced by attorneys and judges. And last, a brief disclaimer. I'd like to make clear that my presentation focuses on mental health and not alcohol or drugs, which are often related problems. And if you take away anything from anything I say today, what I'd like you to take away, and if Jeff, you could go to image four, I'd appreciate it, is that in this area, information and help from trained professionals is all around you. Two more, Jeff. Trained professionals are available online or by telephone, confidential and free. So if any of you now or sometime in the future, yourself or a colleague or a friend may need or may want to explore these resources, if you forget my name and you forget the substance of today's talk, just remember there are trained professionals online or by telephone, confidential and free, that can help you. Now, for those of you in the United States, I'd like to point out a couple of significant resources. The first is the American Bar Association's Commission on Lawyer Assistance Programs. It has a website that is up on the screen there with a wide range of helpful information with resources for professionals, law student mental health days, and numerous other helpful information. Next, the ABA's COLAP directory on state programs lists for all 50 states in the United States resources at the state level. So for example, I'm now in Tennessee, and Tennessee has the Tennessee Lawyer Assistance Program, TLAP, which is on the screen here, which you can see is for judges, attorneys, law students. It's free. You can call, you can email. I know the director, Buddy Stockwell, personally. He'll jump in his car and come out to see you if you reach out to him, and that's needed. With respect to judges, similar available resources are here in the United States, including the ABA's National Helpline for Judges Helping Judges. And as you can see on the screen, there's an 800 number to get you started. Similarly, for those of you outside of the United States, on a global scale, the International Bar Association has its own webpage, which is on the screen, Mental Well-Being in the Legal Profession, which has a wealth of information that's helpful in this area. Plus, more specifically, individual jurisdictions have their own resources. For one, I've picked out Australia, which has the Law Council of Australia's Mental Health and Wellbeing in the Legal Profession webpage. In addition to those type resources, there are plenty of studies, papers, articles, and data available online. Indeed, attorneys in the United States have spent a lot of time studying and investigating mental health and mood disorders over time. And until very recently, most, if not all of that research was focused on attorneys and law students. Two significant works that I'd like to highlight for you is the ABA study called The Prevalence of Substance Use and Other Mental Concerns Among American Attorneys, that was published in 2016, which sampled over 12,000 licensed and employed attorneys. And the next is the American Lawyer Magazine survey 2 years later in 2018, which was a survey, a confidential online survey of legal professionals in the Am Law 200 firms. And just as an aside, both of these studies were prior to COVID, and I personally prefer pre-COVID studies in this area, given the unique stresses from COVID. In addition, there are a few studies dealing specifically with judges in the United States that I'd like to bring to your attention. The first is the National Task Force report in 2017, the Path to Lawyer Wellbeing, Practical Recommendations for Positive Change. It was published in August of 2017. And the next is the U.S. Judiciary study published by the ABA in 2020 called Stress and Resilience in the U.S. Judiciary. It was published in the ABA's 2020 Journal of the Professional Lawyer. And it was based on over 1,000 judges who responded to their survey. Worldwide, there are similar studies, and I'd like to just highlight two of those for you. One is in the UK, the Judiciary of England and Wales did what they called the Judicial Wellbeing Survey 2021 Report and Action Plan, which included responses from over 4,500 judicial office holders. And the next is a survey by the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime, published in March of 2022, called Exploring Linkages Between Judicial Wellbeing and Judicial Integrity. And that study involved more than 750 judges and members of the judiciary spread out over 102 countries, including Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Latin America, the Caribbean, Africa, Asia, and what they call their Pacific group. And a few preliminary observation with respect to the reports focusing on the judiciary. One is the research focusing on the judiciary is very recent and more limited. As you saw above, the National Task Force in 2017, it noted that as of that date, there were no studies specific to judges in the United States. Then there was the U.S. Judiciary Survey in 2020, 3 years later, which acknowledges that it was conducted specifically to fill that void. And the UK survey from 2021 noted that it was the first of its kind. So the focus on the judicial aspect of this is sort of new to the party. Second, I mentioned earlier the effect of COVID. Well, the surveys from 2020, 2021, and 2022 in the US, UK, and UN all noted up front the unique stress presented by COVID. And in fact, the UK survey further acknowledged that due to COVID, its results must be compared to future studies when those stressors are not available. The National Task Force report in 2017, even though there weren't data focused on judges specifically, did bring some preliminary observations, which in a nutshell said that judges face the same or similar challenges the practicing attorneys do, plus some additional information and stressors that are unique to their position and role in the process. And four of the things that the National Task Force said that I think are helpful is judges are not immune from suffering the same stressors as lawyers, and additional stressors are unique to work as a jurist. Next, it noted that many judges, like lawyers, have a strong sense of perfectionism and believe that they must display this perfectionism at all times. Remember the focus on perfectionism because we'll come back to it later. Third, the National task force reported that many judges have the same reticence in seeking help out of the same fear of embarrassment and occupational repercussion that lawyers have. And last, it noted that we have identified isolation as a significant challenge for many members of the judiciary. Now, for a few minutes, I'd like to return our focus to attorneys. And if you pardon me, but as an old trial attorney, I love visuals. So the first is a pie chart on anxiety in U.S. attorneys. The ABA study in 2016 showed that 19% of the respondents reported or admitted to anxiety, and that number shot up to 64% 2 years later when focused on big law firms. Next, when those same two studies looked at depression, the ABA study had 28% of respondents reporting depression and 31% in the ALM survey 2 years later. But if you focus or drill down deeper into the ALM survey of big law firms, two things leaped out at me. One is they asked, do you think the profession has had a negative effect on your mental health over time? 74% of the respondents said yes. Next, it asked, in your professional career, have you ever contemplated suicide? And 17.9% responded yes. And for those of you non-math majors in the audience, that's more than 1 out of every 6 respondents admitted that they had contemplated suicide. What does all of this mean? In my view, it means that mental health and mood disorders impacts every attorney, whether it's you, your law school classmates, or your work colleagues. And in my humble opinion, the most valuable asset in the legal profession is that of the individual attorney. And how this impacts the individual attorneys, I'd like to illustrate those statistics using a hypothetical group of 12 volunteers, which are indicated by the 12 gray figures on the screen at this moment. If you'll recall, 74% said that they had a negative effect on their mental health by their legal careers. So that would be 9 out of the 12, which are those blue figures, which leaves 3 out of 12, or 26%, having no effect on their mental health. But if you'll recall that more than 1 out of 6 had suicidal ideation, that would work out to 2 out of the 12. So when you put it all together in a hypothetical group of 12 attorneys in larger firms, look to your left and your right, because 3/4 of the people are in the blue and red category. And if you expand those numbers to a large firm, and which seems to be the way of the world these days, if you look at a hypothetical law firm with 600 attorneys, that would mean that almost 450 of those attorneys believe that the profession has had a negative effect on their mental health. And over 100 of those attorneys in the 600-person firm have contemplated suicide. This is where I like to pause and ask people to let those numbers sink in. Now, we've been focused up to this point on the individual attorneys in the United States, and I'd like to expand our focus to those to include judges. So when it comes to anxiety in judges, the UK survey from 2021 reported that 76% of the judges reported some level of anxiety, 8% significant anxiety, and 2% extremely anxious. Next, in the UK study, when it came to judicial stress, the UK survey showed that 89% of the respondents admitted having some level of stress. 13% were significantly stressed, 2% extremely stressed. In the UN survey from last year, 92% of the respondents said they were stressed sometimes, frequently, or always. Then when you look at depression in the judicial surveys, in the US study, more than 20% of the respondents were found to meet at least one of the criteria for a depressive order. And when it comes to suicide in judges, the same US study from 2020 reported that slightly more than 2% had experienced thoughts of self-injury or suicide. Jeff, thank you. Now, I take just a minute on the why questions. Why publicize this? Why me and why now? Law students, attorneys, judges, arbitrators, mediators all know that the legal profession and business is inherently stressful. But I think most, if not all of you, are probably stunned by the numbers that we've just gone over. And in my opinion, by any definition, the numbers we've seen indicate that there's a crisis. Next, why me? A few years back, I read an article in the American Lawyer called "Big Law Killed My Husband," an open letter from a Sidley partner's widow. And it was written by Gabe McConnell's wife or widow, Joanne Litt, and published less than a month after his suicide in November of 2018. That article hit me like a brick between the eyes, and you'll know why in a minute. There are eerie parallels in my story and Gabe's story. But thankfully, I survived my suicide attempt. And why me? Why me in this presentation? It's because I'm still here and I'm willing to share my mental health journey since I've been very stable for a number of years now. And in fact, for any of you movie buffs who remember the Academy Award-winning movie Dances with Wolves that won the Best Picture in 1990, the opening scene with Kevin Costner is called the suicide scene, where he rides back and forth in front of phalanx of soldiers shooting at him, fully anticipating being killed. But much to his surprise, he gets to the end of the line and back with his arms outstretched, and all the bullets missed him, and he goes on to have a very successful life. That's how I feel in a nutshell. Why now? Is there ever a good time to talk about a difficult topic? Well, in my view, as the stress levels have increased dramatically in the legal profession, particularly as it has mutated into a business, and it's what I call the bottom line pressure or stresses of the profession. And when my first article in this area first came out, we were in the middle of COVID, which ramped up the level of stress. So that's the answer, why now? There is a lot of information in this area available online. Certainly, almost everything is online these days. I urge you to take a look at that material at your convenience if you are interested. I'm not going to bombard you with it during this presentation, but rather I'd like to share my personal mental health journey as a way of making it real and putting it into context. Another disclaimer, please bear with me for a few minutes because my presentation is not meant to linger on me or my legal career or my diagnosis. It's also not not intended to be an indictment of big law or any firm or any individual, but instead, perhaps, something in my story will touch you the way Gabe's story touched me. Plus, my story is a first-person account that you will not get from most studies, papers, or data. Plus, and at a minimum, what you hear today may provide early warning signs if you or a friend or a colleague face similar situations now or in the future. Very quickly, I was born in San Diego, California in 1956, primarily grew up in the Los Angeles County area of California. I went to UC Berkeley in the mid-70s. I went to Vanderbilt Law School in the late 70s, early 80s. I practiced as a trial lawyer and civil litigator in Los Angeles for a handful of firms. Most notably Sidley and Austin from 1987 through 2000, and Music Peeler and Garrett from 2004 to 2014. I worked on a number of high-profile cases, which I won't bore you with, but as one of my friends calls it, said, Kent, you ran with the big dogs. And during that same time period, I published numerous articles in legal periodicals, including the ABA Journal, the Vanderbilt Lawyer, California Lawyer, the Association of Business Trial Lawyers. And for a very brief moment, maybe my 15 minutes of fame, but more likely my 5 minutes of fame, people in the LA community, including Jeff, may remember that I was on the cover of the LA Lawyer magazine 10 years ago. Now, getting back to the presentation, Gabe and my stories are very similar, but with very different outcomes. And if you'll indulge me, I'd like to review our situations in reverse chronological order. Starting with Gabe's story. In 2018, a little over 4 years ago, Gabe was a 42-year-old attorney, a partner at Sidley and Austin's LA downtown office. He was in charge of a massive bankruptcy filing and under extreme pressure and stress. He succeeded and successfully completed the project by filing the bankruptcy and putting that project behind him. But his personal life behind the scenes, he had graduated third in his law class. He excelled as a chair of Sidley and Austin's student lawyer summer clerk program, but he occasionally struggled with binge drinking and crossed the line, but he sought out and got professional help. And as an aside, even though Gabe and I did not cross paths personally, we have many colleagues in common. And I had breakfast with an old friend of mine a few years back who told me what a great guy Gabe was and a terrific attorney, and that his suicide came without warning and was a horrible shock to all of his professional colleagues. I'm also told that long quotes in PowerPoint presentations are a huge no-no, but I'm going to do so anyway to tell Gabe's story from his widow Joanna's own words. First, when it comes to his family life, she said, I have never seen him so stressed out and anxious. He was trying not to burden me with what was going on, but he wasn't sleeping. I hadn't seen him smile in weeks, and most everything he said was negative. He told me he had experienced stress during cases before, but it had never been this bad. I didn't know what to do. I tried to be positive and encouraging and just make our home as pleasant a place to come home to as possible. When it came to his colleagues at Sidley and Austin, they told her that Gabe was working more with his door closed and his sense of humor had been gone for a while. Then when it talked about fear concerning his career, on one occasion, Joanna had to take Gabe to the emergency room for dehydration because his body was failing him. And on the way to the emergency room, Gabe told his wife, you know, if we go, this is the end of my career. And in response, Joanna told him to quit, but he felt that he couldn't quit in the middle of a case. After his massive bankruptcy filing, Joanna had hoped that they would find a path back to being happy. But instead, Gabe went into the office the Sunday morning following the bankruptcy filing, and he never came home. Instead, he shot himself in the firm's parking lot underneath the building. Joanna's commentary is particularly apropos. In the wake of his sudden passing, she was left adrift. As she characterized it, suicide has now become my new world, and I am desperately searching for answers. Because to those who knew him best, his family, friends, colleagues, this came without warning. Though it's only the beginning stages of trying to figure out why this happened, I came across a concept, maladaptive perfectionism, that combines unrealistic standards of achievement with hypercriticism of failing to meet them. Gabe displayed most, if not all, of the characteristics. Simply put, he would rather die than live with the consequences of people thinking he was a failure. We spoke a handful of times about how he should try to care less about work, but knowing the kind of person my husband was, that was never going to happen. Next, she went on to explain the constant striving to be perfect at work, to be the perfect husband, son, uncle, brother, and friend, and then living with this deep, unbearable shame that he wasn't performing to the impossibly high standards he set for himself. He said a few times he couldn't turn off his head, but again, I didn't understand the severity of that statement. Maladaptive perfectionists lack self-compassion. And finally, but most sadly, Joanna shared, Gabe lived his life with integrity and treated those around him with sincerity, kindness, and a genuine sense of presence. Unfortunately, I know my husband died not knowing the impact he had on so many people. I believe he died feeling overworked, inferior, undervalued, and I know he died with a lot of shame. Joanna's open letter, which was published in the American Lawyer on November 18th, 2018, is very powerful, and I strongly encourage everyone to read it in its entirety. One caveat, I've spoken to medical professionals who tell me that maladaptive perfectionism is not a recognized medical diagnosis. Nonetheless, during my 4 decades in the law, I personally relate very deeply with the characteristics Joanna described, and I've observed them in many of my colleagues. And a further observation, if you'll recall earlier, we saw 4 quotes from the National Task Force focusing on judges in the areas of stress, perfectionism, fear, and isolation. Gabe exhibited all of those. Now, to turn briefly to my story, a brief factual overview. In 1995, 28 years ago, I was a 39-year-old attorney. I was a partner in Sidley and Austin's Los Angeles office downtown. The firm brought me in to save the case from hell, and I was put in charge of fixing discovery problems and avoiding terminating sanctions for our client. I was under extreme pressure and stress, and like Gabe, I successfully completed the project. The discovery mess was resolved and sanctions were not imposed and were taken off the table. But behind the scenes, I was working literally 5 a.m. to 5 p.m., 7 days a week for 6 weeks. My wife was pregnant with our first child and in the final trimester and confined to bed rest. I wasn't sleeping because I couldn't turn my head off. I was drinking at night to get some sleep on the couch. I was obsessing that something was wrong, that it was either the client's fault or my fault, and that somehow, because of my actions, a 150-year-old law firm with 1,600 lawyers would collapse. I was in a mental fog, spinning my wheels, struggling for hours, making bad decisions. But luckily, about 10 days after I successfully met the deadline, I had the good sense to ask the managing partner for time off and to get off of the case going forward. Much like Gabe, when I disclosed my mental problem, I recognized, or at least I understood, that that was going to be the end of my career at Sidley and Austin. I tried to resume my career following the case from hell, but that was an unmitigated disaster. I still wasn't sleeping. I was still obsessing and catastrophizing on my work. I was still in a mental fog, spinning my wheels with lousy output. I was still grinding and trying to push through on willpower alone. And in my bones, I knew that there was something terribly wrong with me, but I had absolutely no clue what it was. So I took a week off for some rest and relaxation in a mountain cabin. But when I came home, I realized that I was damaged goods and dead wood to my big law firm. As soon as my R&R week was over, my wife made an appointment for me to see a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist within 10 minutes diagnosed my condition as suffering from clinical depression. Promptly, my wife and I asked our managing partner to come out to our house midweek at night, which he did. And the result was I immediately took 6 weeks off. And the cover story was that I was helping out at home with our colicky baby who had been born during the middle of all of this. I spent a lot of time in dark rooms, avoiding friends, and I lost over 20 pounds. I returned to work after 6 weeks and immediately went back to grinding, trying to catch up on lost billable hours so that at the end of the year, I would have achieved my annual goal. The firm curtailed my administrative tasks and my compensation stagnated. Proudly, perversely proudly maybe, I still produced quality work and results, and my partners and colleagues were unaware of my mental condition and challenges. Nonetheless, to the firm's hierarchy who knew my situation, I was dead wood. After about 4 years of limbo, I left Sidley in 2000, and I went on to practice litigation and trial work at a smaller firm in Los Angeles and did quality work and published numerous articles. But in 2013 and 2014, my depression returned with a vengeance. And the details for that we can leave for another presentation on another day. But I swallowed enough Ambien to kill a horse on a Sunday night. I woke up the next morning and had a minor car accident and ended up in the ER, and then spent 7 weeks in the Menninger Clinic in the Professionals in Crisis program, filled with attorneys, ER doctors, very high professionals. One thing you learn if you have a mood disorder is that people who suffer from it experience it in their own individual ways. And so all I can talk about is my own experience and how I experienced mood and depression. And in my case, depression looked like negative thoughts in a continual loop, unable to turn off my mind, catastrophic thoughts, loss of sleep. This second time around, I lost 25 pounds. I was still drinking too much, simply trying to shut down my mind to allow me to sleep, which was self-medicating behavior, which I didn't understand at the time. I had my door closed at the office and I avoided colleagues. I turned down lunch invitations with the excuse, well, I'm just working through lunch today. As my condition declined, I was physically frozen at work, and I can't stress on you what it feels like to sit at your desk and not be able to reach out and grab your telephone, even though it's ringing or you know you need to make a phone call. I was physically frozen at home. One day I had actually gotten fully dressed to go to work, but couldn't leave the den where I was. And my wife found me an hour later because she noticed the car was still in the driveway, and she found me in the den. I hadn't moved 6 inches in an hour. When it got really bad, I had suicidal ideation, thinking that it was a good idea and plotting ways to kill myself. And ultimately comes the blackness of total despair, where you are devoid of any hope. And even though I make my living for the last 40 something years, hopefully talking and being persuasive, there's no way that I can bring words to describe what that blackness feels like. But I have found something for people fortunate enough not to go through that. William Styron, the author of multiple books, including Sophie's Choice, who also suffered from depression, wrote an article called Darkness Visible, a Memoir of Madness, that was originally published in the Vanity Fair magazine in December of '89, which he then turned into a small book of only 84 pages the following year. But the basic theme he brings, which when I read his material, I thought that he was telling my story. The pain of severe depression is quite unimaginable to those who have not suffered it, and it kills in many instances because its anguish can no longer be borne. In my experience, there are 4 pillars and cornerstones to mental health problems in the law, and those are shame, stress, status, and stigma. Shame is the most powerful and destructive emotion for those who have a mood disorder. You're acutely ashamed that you're not, quote unquote, normal. It's a very real and powerful and understandable emotion, but actually, the more I learn, it's misplaced, because mood disorder is a physical disease that's treatable. So think of it in terms of diabetes or cancer. Nobody's ashamed if they have diabetes. It is what it is. So the similar shame should not be associated with mood disorder. Second, when it comes to stress, I don't think I need to spend a lot of time with an audience full of legal professionals on stress. It simply comes with the territory. But I do want to emphasize that you must find time to make quality of life by balancing work, family, and outside interests. I heard that a dozen times as a young lawyer and blew it off as that applies to the other guy, not me. That's not true. Third, when it comes to status, a lot of lawyers or attorneys or legal professionals, status is a false idol. There's an elevated place in society, in the community, for being an attorney. There's a high standard of living. There's lucrative earning potential and capacity. But all of those things are attainable even if you have a mood disorder or mental illness. And there's no better proof of that than the 16th president of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, who had what they described at that time as melancholy, which is what we would call depression today. And last but not least is stigma. Historically, societies have stigmatize those with mental illness, but I'm proud to say that those attitudes are evolving, and you need no better proof than to spend 2 minutes on Google, Googling celebrities with bipolar. And I'll give you a heads up. For music fans, Jimi Hendrix, Frank Sinatra, Adele, Selena Gomez, Lady Gaga, Lizzo. For actors, Mel Gibson and plenty of others. Kanye West probably is no surprise. Winston Churchill had lack of sleep, depression, and suicidal thoughts, which he simply described as the black dog. Authors such as Ernest Hemingway and Virginia Woolf. Actors, Mel Gibson comes to mind. Comedians, Russell Brand. There's no end of the people who are out, so hopefully the stigma is gone. At the start, I noted that mine is, at least in my view, a message of hope. And I do not view myself as a mental health evangelist or poster child of mental health problems for those in the law, but rather simply an old trial attorney with many miles of hard road in the rearview mirror, which qualifies me potentially as an expert witness. And if I can survive it, so can others who face their own challenges. And again, in my humble opinion, many, if most, attorneys simply do not know that help is readily available or where to look for it. And all attorneys need to know that help is available, confidential, affordable, and free, instantly available by telephone or only a moment's away on the computer. We're running short on time, but the good news also is in the medical community, they're developing better medications and better approaches and treatments to protocols, and we're a long way away from electric shock therapy. In law schools and law firms, they have mental health days, and some law firms, large law firms, have attorney well-being directors. In the US, generally, there are numerous organizations that deal with mental illness challenges, including DBSA, which is Depression and Bipolar Support Alliance, and the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI. And outside the US, there are a number of countries with similar organizations to assist individuals with mental health challenges. And sticking true to my roots as an old trial attorney, for my closing argument, I'd like to highlight what I hope that I've established or tried to establish today. One is, if you recognize or remember the 12 hypothetical attorneys using the statistics, every attorney, whether themselves, their friends, their colleagues, someone they know, this affects everybody. Next, as I said, if you take anything away from today, remember there are trained professionals online or by telephone, confidential and free. And sources that we looked at that is the ABA's Commission on Lawyer Assistance Programs. It has its COLAP directory for state programs for those of you practicing in the United States. In my experience in the state of Tennessee, there's the TLAP program, which is Tennessee Lawyer Assistance Program. When it comes to judicial officers, the ABA has Judges Helping Judges website. Internationally, there's the IBA's Mental Wellbeing website. And on a more specialized or localized area, we looked at the Law Council of Australia's Mental Health and Wellbeing website. And one thing before I finish my remarks and take questions, not to be lost in all of this is the mental and emotional toll that all of this takes on the family and friends of the patient or the person suffering. They don't suffer alone. The family and friends suffer with them. And a very quick postscript. In my case from hell, after we survived the discovery problem, the case was settled while I was out on the 6 weeks on terms very favorable for the client. And for me personally, I've found much calmer waters in the profession since that day in July of 2015, where I gave it my best shot to kill myself. And quite frankly, honestly, I've never enjoyed the law more than what I'm doing right now. And with that, I'm happy to field any questions that you may have. And I think Jean has some questions from the group. And last but not least, this was the slide that I mentioned. If we run out of time, or if you have a more detailed question, or you want more privacy, that's my personal email and my personal cell phone. I welcome and would be happy to talk to anybody at any time. And if I can help, I'd be happy to do so.
Wow, thank you so much, Kent. That's just gives me goosebumps. So we're so glad you're here to be able to talk to us about this. I remember when that letter, the widow wrote that letter about Gabe, it just, it was just something, just beyond something that we could comprehend really. And although we could certainly understand it, and it was the talk of LA and lawyers around the world, probably.
You can appreciate, I was at the same firm, the same office, the same parking garage as Gabe only 20 years earlier. And but for the grace of God, go on.
Yeah.
So that's why it struck me.
Sure. I'm sure we've all felt the anxiety and all this at some point in our careers, that's for sure. We really just, people were asking for your email address. I'm sure you will get people contacting you. You have a lot of thank yous in the chat. No particular questions. If somebody has one they'd like to ask.
Excuse me, Jean. So Kent, first of all, thank you for sharing so much about yourself and your own personal situation. So much helpful information. Since we know that the practice of law and making a living in general is a stressful thing, how do you distinguish, or how can one distinguish the normal stresses, client demands, financial pressures that are inherent in law practice or adult life, as contrasted to that point where it gets to the line where you really ought to seek some professional help? How do you know you're crossing that line?
I don't know if you ever know for certain. In my case, when I first discovered depression, I was 39 years old. I'd been practicing law for close to 14 years. I was one of, if not the youngest partner in a 1,600 person law firm, and never for a moment felt that I had a medical condition. And in fact, when I had it, I knew something was wrong, but I had no idea what. And I didn't have the foresight or the ability to look into it. It never dawned on me that there were resources available. It never dawned on me, but there was a qualitative difference from the stress that I'd experienced up to that point. But where I crossed the line, I don't know. But you could tell it. And that's the point I hopefully made earlier in this session was, if I'd have heard this as a 30-year-old lawyer, I'd be sitting back comfortably saying, well, this doesn't apply to me. And it probably doesn't for most people in the audience. But that doesn't mean 5 years from now, when your body chemistry changes or the circumstances change, it could be you, or it could be your colleague with the office next door who's got the door closed saying, I'm working through lunch, and no longer has a sense of humor, you know, and is losing 20 pounds. You know, you may want to take it upon yourself to knock on their door and just not be not be obtrusive, but just say, look, you know, if there's anything I can do, or if you think I can be of help, I'm here, period.
Ken, thank you. There's so much more we could discuss. Our time regrettably is up. Thank you so much. Perhaps we saved a life today, and that's a blessing, and we thank you for that. I'm confident that many people will be moved to support the Second Harvest Food Bank of Middle Tennessee. We've posted the link to that worthwhile organization in the chat. Other people may prefer to contribute to a food bank in their own area, or another food bank that is otherwise important to them. If we've moved people to contribute to food banks, if you, Kent, have moved people to contribute to food banks in honor of this presentation, and I know you have, that's a blessing as well. A wonderful presentation, Kent. Thank you again so much. And with that, we are complete.
Thank you.